This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so this is session 1 of Greek 3. Greek 3 is going to cover the indicative system of the Greek verbal system. So kind of like we have been doing before, the first thing that we are going to do is cover the English verbal system before we advance too far into the Greek verbal system. You're going to see there's some ideas that are going to be presented tonight that you may not have heard them called this, but they're ideas that you've probably been using your entire life, and you may not have appreciated them in the past, but they're things that you probably are familiar with, but have never thought about them this way. There are many things that we have in English that are neglected, but actually have a name in Greek, and that's kind of what this is going to go over, is how to find that relationship between the Greek verbal system and things that are equivalent in English. So a verb can describe either an action or a state of being. And in general, there are 3 principal parts, and we'll talk about what that means at some point. Just kind of acknowledging the present, the past, and the past perfect. Okay. What is the future form of a verb in English? Anyone?
Is it I
Okay.
will?
Well, that's the thing. It's actually the present form, but we use a helping verb. So the reason he puts 3 principal parts is because in English, we don't really do any form changes for certain tenses. We just add words in front of it and use the present. Okay. So one of the big things is there are more types of what are called principal parts in Greek than there are in English. Okay. Less helping verbs, more actual forms. All right. So things must agree in person and number. Okay. So can anybody remind us what it means to be, what person means in reference to a verb?
I think I can do it.
Okay.
Okay, first person would be the person speaking. Second person would be the person spoken to. And third person would be the person spoken about. Is that right?
Yeah. Now, if kind of in a concise way, what would be the without just giving this away, what does the person represent? This is a little bit of read my mind, but basically the person represents the perspective of whatever is being spoken about. Okay. So it's referenced to the person, it's in reference to whoever is speaking. Okay. So I would be first, you would be second, they would be third. That's all relative to me. Okay. That becomes, when we start talking about participles, that will come up every now and then. Not a huge thing, but understanding whenever someone is speaking, it's relative to them. Number, what is number? Don't reinvent the wheel. What is number? Gregory, what
Singular,
is,
plural.
yes, singular or plural? How many are there? Okay, so you have the perspective and then you have the number. So first person, singular, is I. It's from my perspective and I'm talking about only me. We is from my perspective and someone else with me. And we are both talking as a group and functioning as one unit. Okay. You and you all, he, she, it, and they. Okay. And they must all agree. So if you use a singular noun, you have to use a singular verb. Okay. And for the purpose of narrative, you're mostly going to be dealing with third person. For the purpose of epistles, you're going to be dealing with primarily second person and the occasional first person. Okay? All right. So whenever we are looking at verbs, there are two main things that we have to consider. Time and tense are the two main things. And this is a little bit harder to wrap your head around. But for our purpose, I want you to consider time and tense as two different things. Okay, time represents when. Tense has to do with when and the way that the word actually looks. Okay, so if you add ed to the end of a word in English, what is the tense? If you go from look to looked, what is the tense with looked?
Past tense.
Okay. What is the time of looked? So the time would be past. The tense is past tense because that includes both the way the word looks and the time that the word represents. Time means when it took place. Okay. And he notes here, time is always from the standpoint of the speaker, not the hearer. A good example of that is if I'm telling a story and I am talking about something that's going to happen and you write that down, or I write it down, and then it's read later and it's after the date when it occurred, it's still going to be future from the perspective of the speaker, even though the events are now in the past. Okay. A good example of this is what's called the historical present. In John's gospel, he uses the historical present most of the time. There's only a few exceptions. We usually will translate that as a past tense verb, even though he's speaking in the present. Because from our perspective, it's something that happened in the past. Now, even to him, it was something that happened in the past, but he's telling the story as if it's unfolding in front of him, which is kind of a neat way to write a story. Not something we really do a lot. Okay. So this is a discussion that exegetically is very interesting from the perspective of actually being able to translate is not going to come up very often. So Mounts, his grammar, his introductory grammar is probably the most popular grammar. And a lot of people would argue that it's the best introductory grammar. But I will tell you that especially people that were trained at Baptist seminaries and more, lack of a better term, more traditional language schools really hate this discussion about aspect. And Mounts, he kind of takes it a little bit to an extreme, especially for a beginning Greek grammar. It's almost like this is kind of his axe to grind, because this is something that, yes, it's interesting, but this is really more of an upper level Greek type discussion. In my training, we didn't talk about it until at least the third year level Greek, and even then it was saved primarily for the last class, which is Greek exegesis. But it's in here, we'll at least cover it. It's really interesting. The research right now is kind of all over the place. So I would say, don't pick any particular mountain as your place to die on, because this could change tomorrow, but this is the best we understand it today. So aspect is concerned not so much with the timing of the action, which is what we're usually talking about in English. It's concerned primarily with the kind of action. And Mounts in this edition has changed his vernacular to be more in line with the way that this is generally talked about in higher level grammars. So here he talks about, I studied last night. So I studied. Does that tell me how long that I studied? Gregory, does it tell me anything about how long I studied?
No.
Does it tell me anything about what I was, I guess, the results of my studying? Does it tell me anything about that?
No.
It just kind of is, right? I did the action, now it's done. That's called the perfective aspect. Now, we're not to the forms yet, but ironic thing about this is perfective aspect and the perfect tense are not the same aspect, which just throws everything for a loop here. In his former books, he referred to it by the English words, and he called that the undefined aspect. And that kind of helps you understand what it is. I run to the store. Doesn't tell me anything about, was it a continuous action? It doesn't tell me anything about the particular, like I said, state that I was in when I was doing it. It just more or less makes a statement. And you see there, it's a simple, complete snapshot, kind of like from a helicopter outside the action. Okay, and he goes through the rest of these, but the idea is you're seeing everything at once, kind of as a nice, complete package. It's perfective in the same tense that we talk about perfect, like in James. It's this idea of completeness. One thing, all wrapped up, it's done. Okay, I was studying last night. Now this is the imperfective or the continuous aspect. So the imperfective has to do with something where you see the action from a continuous basis, like watching a movie, okay, or part of the parade inside the action. So this is like watching the parade in front of you. It's something that's going on and continues for a while. You're not seeing every single part of it at once. You know that there was a beginning, you know that there was an end, but you, at the current state, are seeing all of it. Aren't seeing all of it. So the idea is this movement. That's the main thing about that. All right. You can see here, he kind of breaks it down. In English, you have the present, I study, the past, I studied, and the future, I will study. That's the perfective aspect. The imperfective is I am studying, continues for a while. I was studying. It had a beginning and an end, but you don't know, it lasted for a period of time. And then I will be studying. So you know that there is going to be a definite beginning and end, but there's going to be some amount of time that elapses between. Right? And one of the things that he points out is perfective and punticular are not the same. Okay? It was mainly a gentleman by the name of A.T. Robertson that said we should treat every aorist verb, which happens to be perfective, as a punticular. Now, there's certain statements that are made in the New Testament that certainly would be considered punticular, like Jesus died once for all. Okay, that is punticular because he only died once. It was a single point in time whenever he actually died. Okay, he uses this idea of a bat hitting a ball. There's only a infinitely small amount of time that happened. Not all aorists are that way. It could be punticular, doesn't necessarily have to be. It just means that it happened at some point and you can see it as a whole. Most of you haven't really studied this before, so you don't have to unlearn this bad behavior, but that's really what he's addressing, has more to do with something that's been taught in the past that wasn't true. All right, so in English grammar, there's a relationship between the subject and the verb. There's an active where the subject does an action. There's a passive where the subject receives the action. I hit the ball, okay? That means that I took a bat, I hit the ball. I was hit by the ball. The ball actually takes the action, is doing the hitting, and I am the one who received the action. I was hit. The second thing it talks about there, so that's voice. So it can be active or passive. We don't really talk about the middle much in this book, but that's something we may address at some point. And then there's mood. There's the indicative mood, which is the mood of reality, okay? The non-indicative mood is not necessarily, it's not a lie, it's not like that, but it's the idea of possibility, okay? So the reason I say that, you lie in the indicative mood. If you were to tell a lie, it would be indicative. So you're portraying reality, whether or not it's true or not, okay? Non-indicative tend to have things like may or might kind of associated with them, and they behave a little bit differently. So you have voice, you have mood, and they agree, okay? Here we have something similar, and this is going to be sort of the paradigm. We're not memorizing anything tonight, but this is the way that you form a verb in Greek. So you have a tense stem, you have a connecting vowel, and then you have personal endings, okay? So lu plus omicron plus men equals luamen. Luamen is we loose. right. Once again, you see here the idea of the agreement. O ace a amen eta usi. A ku o is I here. A ku ace is you here. A ku a is he, she, or it hears. A ku amen is we here. A kuete is you here. And a kusi, a ku usi is they here. A ku usi. Kind of fun to say. So you don't have to memorize anything for this week, but this is how this works out. So you have first, second, third person, singular, and plural. So from that perspective, there's actually less forms to memorize than there was in the noun system. Personally, this is just me, I found the indicative system of the verbs actually easier than the nouns. Now, the non-indicative is the hardest part of the book, but the indicative to me was a lot more simple than the nouns were because the forms to me were a little bit more regular. It's more of an opinion than an actual state of fact, but I had less difficulty with the first part that we're going to go through here than I did with the noun system as a whole. So there's our word akuamen. So whenever you parse, you're going to have you're going to go through, and the parsing is going to have its own order. It's a little bit different than what we have for nouns because there's not the same pieces that we have with nouns. So you're going to have person, which is going to be first, second, or third. Number, once again, it's going to be singular, plural. Tense, that's going to be either the ones that we're going to learn right now, it's all going to be present, but present, imperfect, aorist, perfect, future. I'll leave one out. Pluperfect I left out. So you're going to have the tenses. You're going to have the voice, which is going to be almost always active or passive. We're going to talk something about the middle at some point. The middle voice is coming out of favor by the time the New Testament's written, so it doesn't come up all that often. There are a handful of times where the form of the middle and the form of the passive are the same, and it actually changes how you translate it. I know of at least one time in James where that occurred, and we had a discussion whenever I was taking a class translating James. Most of the time, it doesn't make a huge difference in meaning, but there's a handful of times. And then mood. Okay, you ready to get something right for the rest of the semester? For this semester, the mood is indicative. Okay, all of your answers for this semester, the mood is indicative. You can get a point for every single parsing question just by knowing that. Lexical form is the same as before. Just so you're aware, it's the first person singular that's going to be the lexical form, and it's going to usually end in omega. We'll see the exception to that in a little bit. I can't remember if it's this week or next week. And then the inflected meaning, what does it translate to? So a morpheme is a word used or a group of letters used to form the different tenses. And that's the main thing we're going to be concerned with. The participle morpheme is actually a little bit more important than the regular verb morphemes. All right, so we talked about the perfective aspect, simple event, undefined, the imperfective aspect, which is an ongoing action. And then you see something like this. If someone wants to be my disciple, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. Now, which leads to this fun word, actionsart. Has anybody ever heard this word before?
I have, but only because of what I've been reading. I didn't hear it before then.
I have no idea why you would put actionsart in a beginning Greek grammar. But it is kind of a good thing to know whenever you're starting out, because and maybe this is why I put this in here. Going back to the very, very early church, there were two main groups trying to kind of vie for exegetical prowess. There was one group from Antioch, the same Antioch that we find in the Bible, and another from Alexandria. This was roughly from 150 to about 250, something like that. Really early on, the apostles, at least as far as we can tell, are all dead. John may have lingered on, but probably not, unless he was extremely old. In Alexandria, there were a few different people, and they believed in something called allegorical interpretations, and they would find all these different kind of quote unquote hidden meanings behind the text. And a gentleman by the name of, I believe it was Jerome, who said this. It was somebody from the Antiochian school. And I remember he said, seriously, this is the translation of it, sometimes a tree is just a tree. What he meant is you can tear these things apart and try to really focus on the kind of minutia. But at the end of the day, words have intrinsic meaning that sort of go beyond anything that we can necessarily we can put on them. So going back to this particular, does he do it in Greek or see? No. Okay, so going back to this verse, take up his cross, okay? Whenever you look at that word, anybody, let's go to Woodbury. They haven't said anything yet tonight. Going back to our words that we've used before, so you've got the perfective and the imperfective. Can you tell what kind of aspect is being used in take up his cross? Perfective or imperfective? You got one and two. You got a 1 and 2 guess.
Well, we're kind of like a 4 and 1. 4 imperfective and 1 perfective.
All right. So say that one more time. How many?
4 and 1. 4 for imperfective and 1 for perfective.
Okay. Okay. What does everybody else think? Gregory, what do you think?
I'm gonna go with imperfective.
Okay. Victor, is Ezekiel there?
Yeah.
What do you think, Ezekiel?
I guess I'll just go with imperfective.
Okay. Victoria, what do you think?
I think it could probably be either.
That's kind of the point of this. So it's technically in form perfective. Take up is a completed action word. But we know based on the context, this means a continuous action. You keep doing this, right? So you're going to find things that are in aorist, and I think they call this a perfective, perfective in the sense of the perfect tense. I think this is called a perfective aorist, where it's behaving like a perfect, even though the word used there is aorist. So when in doubt, use your brain. Something that trumps everything is the way that it actually works in the sentence, okay? So that's kind of what this idea, this is a German term, and for lack of a better word, it basically means use your brain. There's certain times that no matter what the grammar and so forth says it should mean, when you actually read the sentence, you know that it means something else. And you may still have some of those cards. There is a continuous present, and there is a perfective or particular present that's listed on those cards that I gave you. If you look in Wallace's chapter on this, he talks about the different uses of the present. And yeah, he says, yeah, the present tense usually means continuous action, but there's some exceptions to that. And sometimes just based on the actual way it's phrased, you're going to figure that out. All right. So, in summary, you're going to have agreement between the number. You're going to have agreement in the person. Tense is referring to form. Time is referring to when. Aspect, the primarily ones that we're discussing, is the kind of action. Is it something that happens continuous, or is it something that you can't really tell? Voice is concerned with, is the action being done by the subject, active, or is the subject receiving the action, passive? Mood, as I said before, is going to be indicative for this particular semester, basically. From now until May, it's going to be indicative. The one other thing, and go back to this. So I discussed this a while back. Oh, I thought he had this on here. Okay, there's a difference between a root and a stem. If you have a copy of the textbook, and you look at chapter 15, actually, let's go to 16, because I believe it brings this out. Okay, if you turn to page 168 in the 4th edition, you're going to notice there he has some different stars next to certain words. And whenever you see those stars next to those words, that is a root. You'll notice Lego has multiple. I don't know if we talk about that in this semester, but generally, you're going to see that the root, a lot of times, is going to be, you take off the stem, and a lot of times, if there's a doubled consonant at the end, you drop one of them. We're going to get into that and why. I think the chapter 18 covers that. But the root is that one that's got the asterisk next to it. If you look below it, you're going to see some other forms that look just a little bit different. And those are what's called the principal parts. And that's what I was talking about before, is that the forms that we have in English, there's kind of 3 basic ones, and we add helping verbs. In Greek, there's different forms that change a little bit. If you know the root and you know the rules that we're going to learn, you don't really have to ever memorize stems. But just so you understand, when you take away the endings, that leaves you with a stem. The root might not necessarily be the same thing, okay? I don't think that's going to come up really until chapter 17 when we start talking about contract verbs. Okay. So here, once again, is the way you form. You have your stem on the left, in the middle. So that's not showing my cursor. You have the stem on the left, In the middle, you have the connecting vowel. And at the end, you have the personal endings. So leg plus e plus te gives you legete. You need to be able to parse, and you need to be able to know how to parse and understand the lexical form. And you need to know that a morpheme is the smallest unit that has any type of meaning in a language. Okay. Like I said, the ed ending, it has some degree of meaning. That's an example. The a prefix in English would be another example of a morpheme. It means without. Okay, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about when we talk about morphemes. All right, what questions do you guys have? Just so you're aware, I am never going to ask you a question specifically about aspect. Partially because I think that's sort of beyond an introductory Greek class. Partially because it's going to come out a little bit in your translations anyway. And honestly, that's where I care. Because that's both an exercise of understand the grammar and also an exercise of exegesis, determining what the meaning is.
I have a question,
Yeah.
and I don't know why I didn't notice this until you were just talking now. So are there
Yeah.
only two moods, indicative and non?
So a lot of times whenever we're doing our parsing, we will say indicative or subjunctive or operative or participle. But as far as like the two broad categories, there's basically two.
Okay, so I have that written down, and I didn't know because I have like subjunctive, imperative, operative written down under non-indicatives, but aren't those words, aren't those titles also tenses, names of tenses?
No, they are not.
So they're only mood.
Correct. So you can have an aorist participle. Aorist would be the tense. Participle would be the mood. Does that make sense?
No, not really.
So actually, I'm going to stop the recording.